type of fiction that a lot of people enjoy is detective fiction. A famous example of that, of course, is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of Sherlock Holmes. And in detective fiction, you have this detective who's the master at interpreting clues, at interpreting symbols. And part of the effect of reading a good book like that is it really, inspires you, the reader. At least speaking for myself, let's say, to how can I be better, let's say, at reading the symbols in my day-to-day life? How can I look more closely and be more perspicacious in the way I navigate the world and learn things about maybe other people or about past events by picking up on subtle clues that no one else noticed? And this, of course, is a very fun thought experiment, a very fun flight of fancy, which we can, try to explore in our own life and certainly in the world of fiction. But of course, more often than not, the real world doesn't really work that way. More often than not, signs that we, think we're reading, clues and symbols that we think we're interpreting are actually wrong, are being misread. Because our mind is as a meaning-making apparatus, is always trying to find patterns. And sometimes those patterns are quite spurious in nature. More often than not, if we look closely enough, we'll find that the world of symbols, the world of interpretation, can take on a life of its own. Symbols can become almost self-justifying. Interpretations justify new interpretations, which sort of spill out into new interpretations. And it's very easy for a person's metaphysics, a person's philosophical, interpretive apparatus to lose contact, lose communication with the real world. And in the same way, language, human language, our own inner monologues, have this kind of self-justifying quality. There's a pull to thought. There's a pull to words that impel, that create, that generate more words, and thoughts that generate more thoughts. And sometimes this is, we could be like Sherlock Holmes, and our thoughts are brilliant, and our insights are decoding what's happening in the world around us in very brilliant ways. But more often than not, thoughts are just thoughts, and the spilling out and this production of the inner monologue and the inner dialogue doesn't really lead us anywhere fruitful. My favorite novel of all time is Malloy by Samuel Beckett. Malloy has two parts. The second part of the book Malloy is kind of like an anti-detective novel. It follows this character, Jacques Moran, who gets a mission from a messenger who sends him on a mission to go find this character Malloy. And Jacques Moran fancies himself a kind of Sherlock Holmes, you might say. He narrates his story in the kind of self-assured, brusque staccato of someone who certainly sees himself as having a very sharp mind. And of course, he's also very eloquent, and he has a very powerful voice, narrative as a narrator. But unlike a Sherlock Holmes from a Sir Arthur Conan Doyle story, or a Umberto Eco detective story, our detective is lost. He's quite lost. He's quite lost in this world, this web of the creation of his mind and the creation of his thoughts, and the ambiguity that exists between valid and totally spurious, fictitious interpretations of the world. And so for me, Malloy Part 2 is about the subjectivity of interpretation. It's about shining a light on that interpretive apparatus and highlighting the power and the folly and the absurdity and the ambiguities that are inherent in this project of interpreting our life and our world and the signs of the world that we inhabit. Part 2 of Malloy opens with our narrator recollecting on this time that he got this mission to go find Malloy. And he tells us from the first sentences that at this point he's a ruined man. So we know from the first sentences that this mission doesn't go well. But he writes as follows, quote, "I remember the day I received the order to see about Malloy. It was a Sunday in summer. I was sitting in my little garden in a wicker chair, a black book closed on my knees. It must have been about 11 o'clock, still too early to go to church. I was savoring the day of rest while deploring the importance attached to it in certain parishes. To work, even to play on Sunday, was not of necessity reprehensible, in my opinion. It all depended on the state of mind of him who worked or played, and on the nature of his work, or of his play, in my opinion." And he goes on like this for some time. And we see already from the very beginning that he's immediately pulled in to this question, this religious question about the nature, sort of the metaphysical nature of the day of rest, the Sunday. And this, of course, is one example of the power of those symbols that draw us in, the power of these interpretations and these meanings that us humans create and are in dialogue with, which, again, exist in their own realm, in their own world. But more than just philosophical, metaphysical, religious symbols and interpretations, the book Malloy shines a light on this process of just interpreting the world on a much more basic, fundamental level. And so early on in the story, when Jacques Moran has his mission, he knows that he has to go find this Malloy. He reflects on the different Malloys that he's aware of, the different Malloys that he has, he's in conversation with, so to speak. So he says, "Between the Malloy I stalked within me thus, and the true Malloy, after whom I was so soon to be in full cry over hill and dale, the resemblance cannot have been great." End quote. So he's saying already that there's a difference between the real Malloy and my internal Malloy. But of course we know, and our author, our narrator knows, that it's the internal Malloy ultimately who's operative here. He continues, "I was annexing, perhaps already without my knowing it, to my private Malloy elements of the Malloy described by Geber." Geber is the messenger who gives Jacques this mission. "The fact was that there were three, no, four Malloys. He that inhabited me, my caricature of same, Geber's, and the man of flesh and blood somewhere awaiting me. To these I would add Yuri's, were it not for Geber's corpse fidelity to the letter of his messages." And so now he's getting sucked into this question of whether Yuri, who's this other part of the chain of messages that comes to Jacques Moran, if his Malloy should be counted as a fifth Malloy. And this is the kind of thinking, the kind of problems of symbols, of interpretations, creating their own world of interpretations and meaning, begging more interpretation and more meaning that our author, that our narrator gets sucked into. He says, "Bad reasoning, for could it seriously be supposed that Yuri had confided to Geber all he knew, or thought he knew, about his protege? Assuredly not. He had only revealed what he deemed of relevance for the prompt and proper execution of his orders. I will therefore add a fifth Malloy, that of Yuri. And would not this fifth Malloy necessarily coincide with the fourth? The real one, as the saying is, him dogged by a shadow? I would have given a lot to know. There were others too, of course, but let us leave it at that. If you don't mind, the party is big enough. And let us not meddle either with the question as to how far these five Malloys were constant and how far subject to variation. For there was about this Yuri that he changed his mind with great facility." The story takes us through the misadventures of Jacques Moran and his son chasing Malloy, and as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't go well for our protagonist narrator. But let's just skipping to the end here. As he's arriving back home by himself without his son, a ruined man in a very unhappy, sorry state, he narrates to us the workings of his mind, what's going through his mind at this time. So he has a lot to say, but here's some examples. So he says, Quote, certain questions of a theological nature preoccupied me strangely, as for example, what value is to be attached to the theory that Eve sprang not from Adam's rib, but from a tumor in the fat of his leg? Did the serpent crawl, or as Comester affirms, walk upright? Did Mary conceive through the ear, as Augustine and Adabard assert? How much longer are we to hang about waiting for the Antichrist? Does it really matter which hand is employed to absterge the Podex? What is one to think of the Irish oath sworn by the natives with the right hand on the relics of the saints and the left on the virile member? Does nature observe the Sabbath? Is it true that the devils do not feel the pains of hell? The algebraic theology of Craig, what is one to think of this? Is it true that the infant Saint Roche refused suck on Wednesdays and Fridays? What is one to think of the excommunication of vermin in the 16th century? Is one to approve of the Italian cobbler Levat, who, having cut off his testicles, crucified himself? What was God doing with himself before the creation? Might not the beatific vision become a source of boredom in the long run? Is it true that Judas's torments are suspended on Saturdays? What if the Mass for the dead were read over the living? The last quote I want to share is one of my favorite quotes from the book. It's Jacques Moran almost arriving at home, and he reflects on his bees. We know from the very beginning of the book, from before he sets out, that his bees and his hens are very important to him. He thinks about them often. And so now he's arriving back home, and he reflects on his bees. Quote, I wish to say that I often thought of my bees, more often than my hens, and God knows I thought often of my hens. And I thought above all of their dance, for my bees danced. Oh, not as men dance, to amuse themselves, but in a different way. I alone of all mankind knew this, to the best of my belief. I had investigated this phenomenon very fully. The dance was best to be observed among the bees returning to the hive, laden more or less with nectar, and it involved a great variety of figures and rhythms. These evolutions I finally interpreted as a system of signals, by means of which the incoming bees, satisfied or dissatisfied with their plunder, informed the outgoing bees in what direction to go, and in what not to go. But the outgoing bees danced too. It was no doubt their way of saying, I understand, or don't worry about me. But away from the hive, and busily at work, the bees did not dance. Here their watchword seemed to be every man for himself, assuming bees to be capable of such notions. The most striking feature of the dance was its very complicated figures, traced in flight, and I had classified a great number of these, with their probable meanings. But there was also the question of the hum, so various in tone in the vicinity of the hive that this could hardly be an effective chance. I first concluded that each figure was reinforced by means of a hum peculiar to it, but I was forced to abandon this agreeable hypothesis, for I saw the same figure, at least what I called the same figure, accompanied by very different hums. So that I said, the purpose of the hum is not to emphasize the dance, but on the contrary, to vary it. And the same figure exactly differs in meaning according to the hum that goes with it. And I had collected and classified a great number of observations on the subject, with gratifying results. But there was to be considered not only the figure and the hum, but also the height at which the figure was executed. And I acquired the conviction that the self-same figure accompanied by the self-same hum did not mean at all the same thing at 12 feet from the ground as it did at 6. For the bees did not dance at any level haphazard, but there were 3 or 4 levels, always the same, at which they danced. And in spite of all the pains I have lavished on these problems, I was more than ever stupefied by the complexity of this innumerable dance, involving doubtless other determinants of which I had not the slightest idea. And I said with rapture, here is something I can study all my life and never understand. And all during this long journey home, when I racked my mind for a little joy in store, the thought of my bees and their dance was the nearest thing to comfort, for I was still eager for my little joy from time to time, and I admitted with good grace the possibility that this dance was after all no better than the dances of the people of the West, frivolous and meaningless. But for me, sitting near my sun-drenched hives, it would always be a noble thing to contemplate, too noble ever to be sullied by the cogitations of a man like me, exiled in his manhood.